So I think we'll start. I'm Andrew Dolkart, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Historic Preservation Program. I'm really pleased to be doing this tonight. I was really anxious to do something about preservation and post-war architecture in Los Angeles because there's a lot of interest here at Columbia and in the preservation movement in the East on post-war preservation. In fact, I'm directing a studio this semester that's looking at post-war public schools in Manhattan. I know some of the students are here. But the discourse in the East is very urban focused for the most part, or it's about suburban office parks or the great suburban modernist houses like in New Canaan, but not so much on speculative architecture in the East, and I think largely because we don't really have the kinds of subdivisions that are evident on the West Coast, and also because we don't know how to deal with these. Even when we do have them, this kind of vernacular is not something that we've been tuning into here. So I thought it would be interesting to see how people are tuning into this on the West Coast and issues about the preservation of buildings that are not the great monuments of modernism. And maybe we can learn a lot about how we should be dealing with these resources elsewhere. And I think that LA is really in the forefront of looking at these buildings, surveying these buildings, and beginning to think about how to preserve these buildings, many of which are 50 and 60 years old now. So we have two people speaking tonight who are involved with this. I think I'll introduce them both now, and then they can both speak, and then there'll be a question and answer afterwards. I'm especially pleased to welcome Allison Lyons because she's a 2010 graduate of the Historic Preservation Program, and I was her thesis advisor, and she did a spectacular thesis that had absolutely nothing to do with Los Angeles or post-war architecture. It had to do with Trinity Church Cemetery. She has been working on Survey Los Angeles. Los Angeles has instituted what is probably the most progressive survey project anywhere in America. And so she's been working on that for several years with Architectural Resources Group. The Survey Los Angeles is being done by a number of different private groups have been hired to work on various neighborhoods. Architectural Resources Group does historic resource surveys, does preservation, does architecture and planning with offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Portland. So Allison is right in the thick of working on these projects. And she's going to be followed by Linda Dishman. Linda is the executive director of the Los Angeles Conservancy, a position she's held for 21 years. The Los Angeles Conservancy is the largest membership group of any local preservation organization in the United States, which is really quite amazing. Before coming to the Los Angeles Conservancy, she worked on preservation in Pasadena, and she also worked for the State Historic Preservation Office in California. Some of the things that the Los Angeles Conservancy has been involved with, that Linda has been involved with, are saving Yamasaki Century Plaza Hotel, now actively seeking preservation in the Port of Los Angeles, which is being threatened by expansion of the port, and as Linda said, there's a complete lack of interest at the port itself in preservation, and saving the oldest garden apartment complex in Los Angeles, Wyvern Wood. So very diverse issues of modern design. So I'm going to hand it over to Allison.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's see if I can get this going. Okay, they take care of it for me. Okay. I am Allison Lyons. I'm an architectural historian at Architectural Resources Group. And for the past 3 years, I have been working on a project called SurveyLA. One of the first steps in the preservation of any resource in Los Angeles is its identification. And Los Angeles is quite large, and we didn't know everything that was out there. So in order to tackle that problem first, the Office of Historic Resources at the City of Los Angeles has teamed with the Getty Foundation to do a comprehensive survey of the entire city of Los Angeles. This is called SurveyLA. It's a multi-year, multi-phase project. And this slide shows some of the ways that we've started to break up the city to conduct that survey. Each one of these sort of colored areas is part of a different group of the survey. Consultants are used for every part of the survey, in addition to the Getty and city staff. As Andrew said, I work for one of those consultants in the survey capacity, but consultants are used for every phase of this project, from the drafting of historic context statements to the community outreach efforts to the actual fieldwork. And our purpose with SurveyLA is not to designate properties, it's to identify what we have out there. So just as a point of comparison, these maps are to scale. For those of you not familiar with Los Angeles, it's giant. New York is roughly 305 square miles, depending on where the tide is and who you ask. Los Angeles is 466. Los Angeles is also 880,000 legal parcels, and prior to SurveyLA, only 15% of those had previously been surveyed for historic resources. SurveyLA is not just about the survey of post-war resources. The methodology is suited to the survey of all resources we find in Los Angeles. This is just a selection of some of the things we found. We have a Mission Revival Church up here, very typical craftsman house. This was the home of a very early jazz producer, an early subdivision. Air raid sirens, we have a lot of these left over from the Cold War and World War II. And then this was a utopian farming community in the West Valley from the 1920s. So we do have a lot of resources from before World War II, but Los Angeles is primarily a post-war city. 60% of it was constructed after 1945. And because of that, the methodology that's evolved for SurveyLA, while suited to all resources, is very well suited to the survey of post-war tracts, which we find a lot of in LA. SurveyLA is different from previous historic resources surveys, primarily in its scale and comprehensive approach. One of the things we like to say is, instead of no stone left unturned, it's no cul-de-sac left undriven. We drive every single street for a survey area, and this is part of a reconnaissance process. We make these maps and mark every single street as we drive it, so we're sure that we see everything that could possibly be out there. This has some challenges in Los Angeles. One of these is the hillside topography. There are a lot of mountains in the LA basin, for those of you unfamiliar with it. There are mountains sort of running through the entire city. And because of this, the street facades of buildings sometimes are not their best angle. This is very well illustrated with these platform houses. They were designed by Richard Neutra and William Beckett between 1962 and 1966. This is the view of them from the street as we drove by them. And this is what they look like if you start climbing through the bushes. And finally, if you drive across the canyon, you get an even better view of them, and you can kind of see what remarkable feats of engineering these were. Another one of the challenges in Los Angeles is the scale of some of our post-war tract developments. What we've done to help us as surveyors is develop a pre-field work methodology that uses a lot of GIS. We make tract maps like these that show identifiable patterns of post-war development. And we can preload information into these maps from various sources. The Office of Historic Resources gathers all of this information and loads it into GIS shapefiles that we're able to use to populate maps based on our needs as surveyors. We can also make maps using other research. Recently, a lot of research has come out on architect-designed tract developments, and so we've been creating shapefiles for these and loading them into our maps so that as we're driving around in the field, we can start to tell where these developments were. When we are ready to record resources, we use a custom-designed GIS-based program called the Field Guide Survey System, or FIGS. This is a screenshot that shows the historic context statement for residential development in Los Angeles. As we document resources and identify them, we're able to sort of assign to each parcel or district or even a non-parcel district context. And we use this program to do that. And then we try and create shade so that we can see the tablet in the field. We also use FIGS to document district contributors individually within a district. And finally, there is a free text option where we're able to make a statement about why something is significant. We are about halfway through SurveyLA right now, and one of the results of SurveyLA so far has been that it's helped the preservation community in Los Angeles identify and quantify what we have in LA. We have, sort of with 50% certainty now, the ability to say what's out there, what shape it's in, sort of look at what we thought might be out there and is not in as good of shape as we'd like it to be in. For one type of resource in Los Angeles, the dingbat, which is a particular type of apartment building that was constructed in Los Angeles between 1957 and 1964, that relates to some parking restrictions and zoning laws. We thought they were more ubiquitous than they actually are, and that was a little bit disappointing, but we're able now to say what we actually have out there with regard to dingbats. Another type of development that we see a lot with SurveyLA is the post-war tract development. This has been a major focus of our survey efforts in the San Fernando Valley and areas around the airport and LAX. The San Fernando Valley's here. It's actually this whole thing, but we've so far only surveyed this section of it. And then this is Westchester down by the airport. And there were a number of airports in the San Fernando Valley during the post-war era. These tracts are enormous. They were often pretty modest in scale when they were first constructed. And some of them haven't fared so well over time. There are some really good ones and then some not so good ones. But we've been looking at all of them. We found some smaller tract developments. This is another Neutra development, the Progressive Builders Homes. It was only about 14 properties. The Westchester developments on the small side were 250. So the scale here is very different. And again, with these, we found that they were by and large too altered to find eligible. But also in the category of post-war tract developments, we have hillside communities. And Baldwin Hills Estates was a truly magnificent collection of ranch and modern houses. There are about 800 houses that cover a hill in south central Los Angeles. It was identified as eligible by Survey Los Angeles in July of 2010. And like I said, there's a range of buildings within this district. We have the architect design mid-century modern Ray Cappy building right here. Ray Cappy also did a case study house. And then we have sort of exemplary traditional ranch houses. There are also what we would call an Oriental ranch house style, which is this house, Cape Cod Ranch, and then more of these traditional ranches where the garage doors are pretty integral parts of the facade and often decorated to be part of that ranch theme for the house. The San Fernando Valley has many ranch house districts. Westridge Park was identified by SurveyLA in July of 2012. It's mostly traditional ranch and Cinderella Ranch. Cinderella Ranch is what we call these ranch houses with decorative verge board on the front gables here. They're like traditional ranch with a little more jewelry. There are 386 buildings in this district, and the advertisements that we found for it said that homeowners could choose from 35 different exterior designs. So there's a lot of consistency in the district. And among the post-war architect design modern tracts is Corbin Palms, which was designed by the partnership of Palmer and Krisel. This was the the tract plan that they did. Linda will be discussing this district a bit more, but it was primarily contemporary ranch houses and identified by SurveyLA as a planning district in July of 2012. Contemporary ranch houses have these sort of minimal ornamentation style of ranch houses. So Linda will now talk about what we do with these resources once they've been identified by SurveyLA. And
thanks, Allison, and hopefully my PowerPoint will pop up. There we go. Well, while we're waiting for that, I just want to get a show of hands. How many people have been to Los Angeles? All right, a lot of people have been to Los Angeles. That's good. For those of you that haven't been, how many want to go to Los Angeles? No hands. Okay, one hand. Okay, good. All right. Thank heavens most of you have already been to Los Angeles. When the call came to talk about preserving postwar LA, I was like, really? People in New York care about this? But anyway, so I'm really glad that all of you are here today, and we can kind of follow up on Allison. And the Survey LA has been really important because we had no idea what historic resources we had. And so you're really operating in the dark. Is every 60s building important? Is every dingbat important? So the Survey LA is really starting to help us come to grips with what is historic and what's not. Now, we're talking about post-war suburbia, but I have to say that for those of you that don't know, LA is a very old city. This is the secret. We don't talk about it much, but we were founded in 1781. And we live in people's minds as part of the stereotype that we're all post-war, and in fact, 60%, as Allison said, of our housing, or 60% of our buildings really are after World War II. But we do have this legacy. And here, whoops, I went too far. Oh, you know what, I moved that wrong, never mind. Here is the oldest house in Los Angeles, and it dates from 1781. So even in New York, that would be an old house. And here it is today. And from this, you'll see sort of how these ranch houses evolve. But we own the ranch house. I mean, the stereotype is ours, but it's really our stereotype and our history. And so, you know, I, for one, have a very strong fondness for ranch houses, and because it is so much a part of our history, and that really is throughout the state of California. And here you can kind of see the lines are kind of similar with the porch there from the historic Sanchez adobe. In looking at ranch houses, knowing that it has history, it also is about a certain time in our history. And Los Angeles almost doubled its population in 30 years. So that is a lot of people. 1.3 million people came to Los Angeles and you know, wanted to live somewhere. So this will take a little minute. There it goes. So you'll see, these are when permits were pulled, you can see sort of the whole dynamic. This is the San Fernando Valley, which Allison showed you on the larger map. But you can see how much development actually occurred in the San Fernando Valley within about a 25-year period, 30-year period, which tells you the magnitude of what we have that's coming of age right now. So there we have. So we have all these people. We have them all coming. A lot of these are people that have been in the service that were in Los Angeles, or people that heard about the mythical qualities of Los Angeles and decided to go someplace new. They're all coming to Los Angeles, and where are they going to go? So they're going to live in the suburbs. And part of that had to do with the Federal Housing Administration, which changed dramatically how home loans were done. And so part of this is sort of the impact on federal policy in the development. Here we have Eastwood Estates. And this is very important because at the very top it says climate controlled. And the valley is about 5 degrees hotter than the rest of Los Angeles. And so having air conditioning actually made the valley seem much more palatable to people moving into that area. And there's also a lot of swimming pools in the valley. In looking at post-war suburbia, not everybody starts out with thinking that this needs to be saved. And, you know, our job as the LA Conservancy, as, you know, passionate preservationists, is to get people thinking about, is this building historic? You know, is there a context that we should be looking at to say why this house, why this neighborhood is in fact significant? And why did the houses look the way they do? I think that that's part of this too, because you look at a ranch house, you think, okay, it's kind of, you know, It's sort of fun looking, it's sort of boring looking. I mean, you know, there's a wide variety of them. But I think part of this, is, at least at the Conservancy, our work has been to get people out and get them into the neighborhoods and walking and touching these historic buildings. What? Oh, wrong one, sorry. So the LA Conservancy has a volunteer committee called the Modern Committee, or ModCom. And in 1994, they did a tour that was a day in the life of Los Angeles, cruising Postwar LA. And they featured the Gregory Ain tract, which is that neighborhood. And it was a huge success. And people came out and they looked at this suburb. And all of a sudden, people in the Ain tract started looking at their neighborhood differently. You know, 600 people came to look at their neighborhood. Wonder maybe we need to find out what's going on here. So then we did another tour in 2000. Once again, our ModCom, How Modern Was My Valley. That was a 2-day tour of the San Fernando Valley. It gives you an idea of how big the San Fernando Valley is. It took 2 days to do a tour. And that one focused on Balboa Highlands, which is up there at the top. And here is a slide of people actually walking and listening to a docent. And I do think that getting people out is really critical to changing people's perceptions. It's one thing to look at a slide in a lecture hall. It's another to actually be out and see how the living room flows into the dining room. And then we did a tour, kind of our traditional historic district tour in Los Angeles. They're called HPOZ's Historic Preservation Overlay Zone. So we featured 5 traditional craftsman, revival-style neighborhoods, and we went back to the Ain tract with our very modern resource. And one reason it's important to get people in is you can drive by and get a sense like, oh, that's nice modern architecture, but you have to get inside to really understand what the architect was thinking. And Gregory Ain was very interested in how families lived. And this is immediately after the war, sort of the role of the wife is changing. And he felt that the wife needed to know what those kids were doing at all times. So there's actually a hole in the in the kitchen to the living room and the dining area, so that the mother can be watching those kids at all times. And the way that the windows are designed in the house with the backyard and the front yard is sort of the same situation. So there is more fear about the world as opposed to the more bucolic pre-war that kids will survive. Another thing that Ain was very interested in was making houses that could be altered in an appropriate way, of course, that could be set up for different types of living situations. So on the top slide, you see the panel door completely open, so it's being used as a dining room. On the slide on the right, you see that the door comes closed and that same space can be used as a master bedroom. So he was already thinking about changing families, how do people use this space in a way that is workable for the future. And then we did our 2020, which was the 20th anniversary of our Modern Committee, and once again went back to the Mar Vista tract. And partly at this point, it became clear that this neighborhood got it. They were very excited about being a historic neighborhood. They really understood what they had and came out in full force to support this. And then Spectacular Vernacular was our attempt to really look at the high-end, the Neutra, and then how did that get translated down into the masses. And so we went to Corbin Palms, which Allison mentioned is a neighborhood of just amazing modern houses. When we were there in 2006, it was an intact neighborhood. When SurveyLA came, it was in 2012, it was not. And by the time we went back in 2010, it no longer read as a district. So that's one of the reasons that our educational programming is so important, is that there is change happening every day, house by house. And if we don't really get out there ahead of this, then we're going to just lose entire districts. So in talking about protection, I wanted to kind of talk through 2 modern districts that have been designated in Los Angeles. The first one is the Gregory Ain tract, and all of these houses were built in 1948. Gregory Ain called them modernique, was his little catchy phrase. And what's interesting is that the FHA was very nervous about this concept of modern. And they almost didn't fund the project. And in fact, they insisted upon a first phase. And so only 52 houses were built in the first phase, and actually the developer didn't finish the next part of it. But he wanted to intersperse Cape Cod and traditional ranch houses in with the modern houses because they were just so concerned that these modernique houses were not really going to be a big seller. And so from that beginning, you have FHA, unlike in current times, actually worrying about protecting the value of their loan guarantees on this property and actually inserting their will into these subdivisions. Now, these units are actually pretty small. They're about 1,060 square feet, hence the sort of movable panels, which give you space in different types of ways. And what's interesting is these units are pretty much, with a few small exceptions, identical. It's just the plan is rotated in different ways on the lot. So you actually think that there are 4 different models on in the subdivision, but they're all the same floor plan. They're just moved around a little bit. So the HPOZ was adopted in 2003. And it's the first post-war. And one of the things that is good about our HPOZ process is that each neighborhood can develop their own preservation plan. And so the Ain Tract residents really embraced their inner modernism. And their tract, actually, their preservation plan is very specific to how they are going to interpret the Secretary of Interior standards, how they're talking about landscaping. And landscaping is very important in this district because it was designed by Garrett Ekbo, a very important Southern California landscape architect, to be very open. So there weren't fences, there weren't bushes that kind of obscured the view from the street. And so in their preservation plan, they actually regulate landscaping in these yards, which is not typical for many of the HPOZs in Los Angeles. Our next HPOZ that was designated post-war is Balboa Highlands. And this was an Eichler tract, and you've probably heard of Eichler. Very important developer, did tens of thousands of units in Northern California, only did 3 developments in Southern California, and this is one of them. These were much larger units. Kind of, you can see the transition from the late 40s. Balboa Highlands was constructed between 1962 and 1964. Here to give you an idea of what these look like. This is typical for an Eichler development in that it all centers toward an interior courtyard and not focused on the street. So unlike Gregory Ain, who wanted the mother to be able to watch those kids in the front yard, that mother does not know what's going on with the kids in the front yard. But it kind of represents a different time frame. There were 4 models, and we had the gable roof, the A-frame, and there were 2 flat roof versions of the house. And these have become very popular also. Once again, when you bring a bunch of people to the neighborhood, people start to ask questions, I live in a historic neighborhood? And then start to wonder when people are doing things in their neighborhoods. This also has an FHA story, and I think that's one of the things that, we're talking about post-war. It's not just about the architecture, it really are the stories too. Why were these developed and how? And the FHA story here is that, believe it or not, the FHA required racial and ethnic covenants to be inserted into all of their loans. Because they felt that to protect their investment again, and this is the quote that we used, was the harmonious, attractive neighborhoods that they wanted, thereby protecting their investment, that they would have those covenants in there. So this was the only one. Eichler refused to do that and ultimately got that through the FHA, but this was the only subdivision built in the San Fernando Valley, with the exception of Pacoima, which was sort of an area without covenants, so there's a lot of ethnic diversity there. But that makes this very important too, is that the developer sort of stood up and said no. And because he was such an established developer from Northern California, he had the credibility with the FHA to be able to do that. Now in Corbin Palms, we talked about it, and I had to tell you it was heartbreaking to us at the Conservancy to go back into a neighborhood 4 years after we had done a tour and see how much change had happened. And so we work, we were working with the owner. This was actually the house we featured on the tour. And he really wanted to designate his house. He felt that he wanted to make that statement that it was intact and soon there might not be very many more. So he wanted to do that. And so we worked with kids at a high school that's not far away, at Kennedy High School, to prepare local historic nominations. And so we actually worked with the kids. And they went in and testified. This is them at the Cultural Heritage Commission. And it was really interesting seeing the kids' response. Some of them were growing up in ranch houses, some of them, growing up in apartments. But just sort of the way that this house was curated, because this was a very dedicated owner, and he had the original brochures, and so we were there with the kids while they were doing the description and writing that up and everything. And it was really, heartwarming to see sort of how they reacted to this and how they became very passionate. And they did a phenomenal job. I mean, these were 15 and 16-year-old students that are doing this presentation. They just did an amazing job at the Cultural Heritage Commission. So they were very endearing, and it was, in fact, approved. So we've talked about identification, we've talked about awareness building, and we've talked about some protection, but I think, particularly with Allison's comments about SurveyLA, and I'm on the review committee for SurveyLA, so I see all the results, and we sit in a room and argue, which is fun for some. I don't know if it's fun for everybody. But it's really becoming clear that we are at a kind of an important point in how we're approaching preservation. And in looking at kind of the two post-war suburbs that have been designated as HPOZs, it really were the neighborhoods we'd worked in. And so I think it's really kind of a call to action to the Conservancy to really be working in more neighborhoods. And so that's one of the things that that we'll be doing. But partly by having the SurveyLA results is we get a much better sense of what there is and what's important. So we have modern, here we have modern, here we have more modern. And initially it was sort of hard to realize that was a ranch house, but in some of the more academic research that's been done and sort of more of the popular culture, I think most things post-war are being considered sort of in the ranch house if they have a free-flowing plan and are from that time period. So we have the really modern, we have the fabulous rock roof. Rock roof, how could you not say that that needs to be preserved? We have the very rustic, which fits very well with the agricultural history of Los Angeles, particularly in the San Fernando Valley. And my personal favorite, the Oriental spaceship, which is just, it kind of embraces all about Los Angeles and kind of the adaptation of culture into a modern world. So there's a lot to love and there's a lot to embrace, but the question really is, what do we do with this information? So we have these resources. We need to be reaching out to the people that own them. And this is really critical because a lot of these ranch houses are going through a tremendous change right now because they were built in the 50s and 60s and a few into the 70s. Those owners are dying off. And so there is great change sort of coming to the neighborhoods. So I think one of the things we need to do is make ranch houses trendy. Whoops, go back. And here you can see, the equivalent of the hipster home buyer has the orange fence, has the drought-tolerant landscaping, kind of the ubiquitous concrete steps with grass in between. But it says that that's a fun person in there. And I think that is part of what we need to do. I think we can't always take ourselves so seriously. And I think particularly with older houses, there is a tendency to do that. With ranch houses, there's a lot of flexibility with these houses. And so how do we begin to look at that? And, I think reaching out to realtors is very important. One of the things that we saw, particularly with the Balboa, Highlands, and the Ain Tract, is when we started using those phrases, believe me, the realtors picked them up. And because they know that that will increase the value. And we do know that within the HPOZs, the value does increase with people because they want to be in certain areas. The whole concept of ranch houses is they usually were built in multiples, but we also have a situation where the multiples have been altered or have gone away. So it's sort of looking at what is the importance in the mapping? And SurveyLA is doing an amazing job with the mapping. So here we have a neighborhood pretty consistently intact, but that could change in another year. So we're, the whole concept of planning districts, which don't have the same protection as the HPOZ because it doesn't have a local review body, but it does have certain review by the planning department. And so that will be very important in terms of really keeping those districts. The other thing that is important with this is that I think we have a very good handle on the architect design subdivisions. So Balboa Highlands, the Gregory Ain Tract, and even Corbin Palms were all designed by architects. But the vast majority of the post-war suburbs, or the tract developments in Los Angeles, were developed by contractors who either developed them themselves, stole from an architect's design when they went through an open house, or actually bought plans through the mail to do this. And so that, I think, is the next kind of frontier for us, is to be really focusing on some of these neighborhoods that are not, in fact, architect design, but still have a cohesiveness that really still speaks to the fact that this is a post-war suburb. And we need to be looking at more individual nominations. And I think part of this is working with receptive owners. One of the concerns we had with the Cultural Heritage Commission was, since this was part of a larger tract, would they find that one building significant without really having any kind of other association with the house? And the kids were very convincing, plus who would want to tell these kids no? But I think that we need to be looking at that more, because there will be a time when our dingbats are becoming quite small. The number, ubiquitous is no longer a term we can apply to that. But the other part of individual nominations is that we do have financial incentives available. And so in California, we have what's known as the Mills Act, which, if you're designated, you can have your property taxes lowered and you can reinvest that money into the property. And we've seen, in craftsman neighborhood after craftsman neighborhood after period revival, the amazing impact that the Mills Act has had in getting people to invest in property and also protecting it. And so I think that we need to make a real push with the post-war suburbs and make sure that they're aware of the incentives and are really focused on taking advantage of that. Because if we don't, this is what we have. This is when ranch houses go to Italy. They get their Tuscan approach, and that to me is incredibly sad. So you can see there's the garage is there on the right, and nothing else is any kind of sense of its origins as a ranch house. And so that to me is the real kind of inspiration of why we need to keep moving forward on this. But the good news is that we have a legion of people that were raised or bought ranch houses. So I think we have acquired, this is me in front of the ranch house I grew up in Sacramento. And it's fascinating to me, as the Conservancy has been doing more work in the kind of the post-war suburbs, is how many people that are, ambulatory and articulate and everything else grew up in ranch houses. And I think part of what we as preservationists need to do is do a better job at tapping into this group of baby boomers that were the first people that lived in these houses, and then coming up with the next generation of people too. Because these houses are continuing to be used on a, obviously daily basis. And we also need to be reaching out, because some of them have become, even, the racial and ethnic covenants are gone, have become, at least in Los Angeles, very significant Latino neighborhoods. And so I think part of our goal is to really be reaching out and talking about the origin of the ranch house, so that everybody is aware of what it is and why it's significant. And through that, will then want to embrace their inner ranch house and celebrate it, and then protect it and take care of it, so that we'll see less alterations and more orange fences. So thank you very much, and we look forward to questions.
Why don't we sit at the table? So I've heard mention of the Cultural Heritage Commission, Historic Preservation Overlay Zone, and I think Allison mentioned something about a planning area. I didn't write it down right away, so I may have gotten that wrong. So what is the legal mechanism? I know that the whole survey, as you mentioned, Allison, is to identify. But once something is identified as significant, either as a group of buildings or an individual building, what legal mechanism is there to try to preserve it in Los Angeles?
Want me to do it? Sure, I'll take that one. I don't know how many of you are familiar. In California, we have something that's called the California Environmental Quality Act. And so the good news here is if something's identified in the survey as being eligible for local designation or California or National Register, it gets triggered in the planning department. So our hope is that as more of these survey areas are adopted, that we will be able to sort of have an opportunity to have a conversation, not us, the city will have an opportunity to have a conversation with people about changing out their windows or changing their front doors or, doing a huge addition or, stuccoing a wood frame ranch house or people with a stucco house putting wood frame on, so that there is sort of an opportunity here. And that's with the planning districts in particular, is that there would be sort of an intermediary time period to be able to talk to people. So it doesn't provide the same protection as designation, so the HPOZs have much stronger protection, and that's why they would be eligible for the Mills Act. But it is some level of conversation that hopefully would take place.
Yeah, go ahead.
The difference between a planning district and a historic district for the purposes of the, is that better? For the purposes of the survey, when we're in the field, we document each individual contributor and non-contributor in a historic district. In a planning district, we think that it's eligible for special consideration in the planning process, but we don't go through and determine contributors and non-contributors, potential non-contributors in the field at the time of the identification.
So before, actually, I forgot what my first question was going to be, is just for those of people in the audience like me who may have grown up in a place like New York City, tell us how you define a ranch house. I know some of my parents' friends would move out to Long Island, and they would either buy a ranch house or a split level. But none of the buildings you showed look quite like what you see out on Long Island. So what is a ranch house? Is it one story? Can it be more than one story? I know you said open plan.
Mm-hmm. It can be 2 stories. We don't have as much split level because we're more flat. So we would not necessarily work out with the topography except for in the hillsides. But it's something, because I've sort of struggled with that. I thought ranch houses looked kind of rustic, had the asymmetrical facade, had the little dove coat, different things. But as we've gotten further and further into SurveyLA, I think it's becoming much more accepted, at least I'm giving in on this point, that modern houses, and that's why I wanted to show the different styles of ranch that really do qualify as sort of the in quotes ranch house. Part of it is there were so many people doing this work, and some people thought they were ranch, some people didn't. Gregory did not think he was building ranch. And I think most people would say that his houses are not ranch for a variety of reasons. But I think most of it is post-war, and most of the post-war is ranch, and I think Allison can kind of go into more specifics in terms of how they looked at that. But ranch houses tend to have a more open floor plan, tend to have a sense of indoor-outdoor, even though it doesn't look modernist, unless it's a modern ranch. But it was a lot about how people lived at that time. And you had major practitioners like Cliff May doing work that then was filtered down through Sunset Magazine and was published across the country. And a lot of his houses you can find in suburbs really across the West, if not the rest of the country. So it's a feeling as much as it is an architecture.
And we also look at elements of each house. For example, many of the traditional ranch houses have dovecotes.
Yes, I know. I was noticing that the doves are very well housed in Los Angeles.
They are, yeah. We have dove condos sometimes. But they can be single-family homes. We've looked at a number of multifamily apartment buildings, 2 stories, that we considered ranch houses. We have a very thorough context statement that outlines the features of each type of ranch house that we identify in the survey.
So in New York, we found that there has developed a kind of cultural interest in landmark designation, and that there are a lot of neighborhoods that are beating down the door of the Landmarks Commission to get landmarks designation as historic districts, and the commission can't get to them all. Is there such an interest in Los Angeles? Is there a citizens' community interest in a lot of these post-war areas that has resulted in preservation efforts?
I think we don't have a huge backlog in the post-war suburbs, but we have a backlog, I think, of 9 to 10 more traditional neighborhoods that are in the process of becoming HPOZs. And part of what has happened with budget cutbacks is that the city is saying they're not going to designate any more HPOZs without additional staff in the planning department, which is huge. Because in Los Angeles, I don't know if I'm not as clear about the process here, but in Los Angeles, neighbors have to actually go organize. So 60% of the property owners in a neighborhood have to sign a petition saying they support the designation. And that's a lot of knocking on doors. And that's like, in my mind, that's the plus side of HPOZs, is that you have people that get to know their neighbors. And, you know, they go knock on the door and they say, hey, we really want to protect our neighborhood. You have a great house. And then it gets neighbors talking to each other. And so the fact that we've got, 8 or 9 of these neighborhoods that have gotten their 60% and have, for the most part, done their survey in preparation for that and now can't go to the next level, that's very discouraging. So we have really not been reaching out to neighborhoods as much as we used to, because it just seems kind of sad to get people excited and then have it not be able to go through the process. So that's something that we're advocating at City Hall to get additional funding so that we can expand the HPOZ program.
So one more question. Allison, you mentioned that there were 800,000 tracts. Is that right?
There are 880,000 parcels in the city.
Okay. So when SurveyLA is done, will you have looked at, would somebody have driven by every one of those 880,000 tracts?
Almost. We are not resurveying areas that are designated. So HPOZ, for example, we would not
So, but basically
that.
every tract would have been looked at some point.
Yes.
And how, is there a cutoff date? Are there tracts, let's say, that were built later than a certain date that don't really get looked at?
We haven't been looking at post-1980 resources unless they are identified by community members or historians in previous surveys. So if there are entire neighborhoods of post-1980 development, we mark those on a map. We don't look at them again for SurveyLA.
So let me open it up to the floor. Yeah, Gregory.
I'm just curious.
Oh, wait, there's a microphone coming.
I grew up in Pacific Palisades, and to me that community is rather eclectic with respect to, architecture. And I was just wondering, when you're not given the benefit of a planned, subdivision, how do you go about dealing with a really eclectic group of houses? Are you looking at aerials, or because clearly you're not going through every building permit for a windshield survey?
No. We would drive every street of the neighborhood, and oftentimes there's what we call preloaded information from various sources. If there are architect-designed houses, we identify those and record them. We wouldn't look at an eclectic mixed-year neighborhood and say, this is a great district, because it doesn't really have that unifying characteristic that would make it a district. But we would look at individual buildings within there.
And basically see what jumps out at you then, or?
What jumps out at us, or what has been previously identified and called to our attention. Some things have status codes from previous surveys, and so we know that they're out there. Other times, a researcher, the architecture students or historic preservation students at USC have been doing a lot of research on this. They'll give us lists of buildings, and so we'll mark those and check them out when we're doing our survey.
And one of the things about SurveyLA is that it's a tremendous resource, but it's the beginning of the conversation of identification of resources and not the end. And partly that's because it's a visual survey, and while the city has done a lot of outreach to try and pull other pieces of information into the process, it's just not happening for the 880,000 parcels. So we keep saying, you know, the only real surety that there will be is if your house is determined to be historic by the survey, not particularly if your house is not historic or your building.
But then what happens if your house is determined to be historic or of architectural distinction? It's been surveyed, it's been identified. I'm assuming from all the pictures that there must be a lot of these houses or buildings. I assume you're looking at more than just houses.
Yeah.
A lot of these buildings. So does it just go into a database? Are the owners contacted? Are efforts made to designate it as an individual landmark?
Do you want me to take it? Sure. SurveyLA is very specifically not designating as part of the survey process because they don't want it to become that political. So this is very much just an identification process. It'll be up to groups like the LA Conservancy to do nominations, neighborhood associations, neighborhood councils, when things are threatened, to be able to do the designation process. And I think that is important because when you start looking at these ranch houses, and I have to say I even felt this way when we started the process. I thought, there's so many of them, really? And we were a little concerned about the Corbin Palms house because of that. And it was only because we went back to the neighborhood and saw that it wasn't a cohesive neighborhood and no longer qualified as a HPOZ that we began to say, okay, let's put this one house forward. So the sense of plenty is I think, a kind of a stumbling block a lot of times for preservation, particularly in the post-war. And one of the things that we've really done at the Conservancy, at least we're trying to do, is to not just save what's left of a period, but save what's really best of a period. And so when we were very involved with saving the Century Plaza Hotel, you know, we knew that that was one of the, you know, top 60s buildings. And so we needed to make this an all-out fight. We were fighting two other 60s buildings at the same time, which did not have a happy ending, but they also weren't as significant as the Century Plaza Hotel. So I think with the survey, we'll be able to have a better ability to look at, you know, what is the best. When we did one of the first survey areas, we had a district of dingbat apartments, and it was very controversial. You know, well, there's other dingbats, but here's the best district, and we just can't be saying all those dingbats are eligible. I mean, really, dingbats. I mean, the conversation was like, you know, really? But then, as we started going through, in the San Fernando Valley, I think there were 5 dingbat apartments identified that still had their integrity. When you start, you know, talking about things less than 2 hands, that's not very many resources, and they're no longer ubiquitous. And so when do we begin to start talking about that? And so we'll be going back to Hollywood, where there are some other dingbats that are still intact, because, you know, that's important, and that's a type, and there's a movie about, you know, the dingbats in Beverly Hills. So, you know, it's you know, it's on the silver screen. But that's the real value of SurveyLA, is it puts it in perspective. What is ubiquitous and what is now rare?
Yes.
For the purposes of your preservation efforts, how do you determine what is and what isn't a suburb in a city like Los Angeles? I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles, and it really seems to me to be a collection of suburbs, more than like a unified urban space. So I was wondering where you draw the line between what is a suburb and what is an urban center.
We usually look at the tracts of single-family development from the post-war era as representative of the post-war suburbanization, residential type or residential development. So I guess everything's a suburb. We don't. The property type isn't really non-suburb for any kind of residential development that you see from the post-war era in Los Angeles. So I think you're right to say the whole city's a suburb in some ways, but it's just the property type that we call suburbanization, and we analyze it as a suburb, even though it may be pretty dense in its population.
Yep.
One of the problems we have in New York is we have a lot of buildings that might be not considered perhaps contributing to a district. They may not be that special, but if you go through Paris street by street and look at every facade very carefully, you see they're often not really distinguished, but they make a city. The same way Greenwich Village is full of buildings that are, the West Village has much more spectacular buildings than east of 6th Avenue, but these buildings contribute to your sense of the city. When you go through, you feel a certain texture, feel a certain comfort. They're not fabulous. They're not done by any famous architect. If you start getting too many Tuscan replacements, you're going to lose that sense, even though they're not taking down star quality buildings. So this is not to put this on your shoulders, because you can't do 880,000 historic preservation nominations, but still, I think it's a concern in all of our, especially in suburbs, where there are no obvious districts of all high quality buildings, that kind of thing.
Right. I think you've hit something very important, and that's why with the HPOZs and with the planning districts, we can start to talk about neighborhoods. And so individually, one ranch house may not be eligible, but if there's 200 of them in an area, then they do become significant. And usually there's a story associated with the developer, because these were all wild and crazy guys. So the thing that I think is the biggest kind of erosion factor is Home Depot. And it's changing the windows, it's getting a new carriage front door that looks so country. It's putting in these different types of landscaping that are hedges that basically wall off the house from the street. So I kind of liken it to nibbling a neighborhood to death. It's a little bit here, it's a little bit there, and then we have to have the new front door. And that's just going to make it fabulous. So, and then you get one person that has the new front door, and then you see him just go down the street. So we do still live in the era of keeping up with the Joneses, and I think that's why the education part of what the Conservancy has done through the years, and based on what we're finding, particularly in SurveyLA, we'll really be amping that up. There have been a lot of educational outreach to craftsman homeowners, so they understood wood windows, maybe they're a good idea. But a lot of these ranch houses have aluminum windows, and one of the things we need to face as preservationists is that these tract houses are not being made with old growth redwood. They're not being made in the same style and craftsmanship that these earlier houses were. These were often pre-assembled and put together on site. They don't have the same quality of materials. And so that is going to be something as preservationists we need to deal with. Either we need to look at replacement windows that can fit, because aluminum has a lifespan of 40 years. And some of these are getting to that. There are ways to restore aluminum, but it's not easy or plentiful. And so that's part of what I think as preservationists we need to do. But it is the nibbling, and I think getting at it from an education perspective and really working with homeowners. I grew up in Northern California. Obviously, you saw me at Easter in front of the house, and my cousin lives in a California ranch house, and they were very proud they had replaced all their windows. And they had replaced all their windows for energy conservation. And she didn't know she had a ranch house that would have been considered historic. And so, it became very clear to me that people are doing things for the right reasons. They want to have a house that's more energy efficient. But how do we begin to address those concerns in a way that still respects the quality of these buildings so they retain their sense of place and their eligibility either as a district or individually?
Yeah, Frampton.
Are the results, or will the results of SurveyLA be made public? I guess both for homeowners to find out if their homes are historic, but also a conversation we've had in New York before is sometimes making surveys public. Will developers find out that their building is now considered, possibly significant and move to demolish before anything else is done?
The survey results are public. Reports on the area, every district identified, every individual identified, and every non-parcel resource identified are available online. As far as what developers do once they find out about that, I'm not really involved at that point, so I can't speak to it.
That'd be me.
So I'll turn that over to Linda.
It has been a concern, and part of the concern has been if we had some early survey results go public, would the city withdraw from doing the rest of the survey? And so I think it has not been widely promoted at this point, which I think probably is strategically the right thing to do. There has been outreach in specific areas. Initially, the survey was supposed to combine with community plans being updated in all the 33 community plan areas of the city of LA. And that hasn't happened on the planning side for a variety of reasons in terms of staffing. So that would have made it more public. But we haven't had any huge hue and cry yet. But I think part of that's because it's not, they're not Google ads that say go see your property on SurveyLA.
Yeah.
Can you say something about the four models of Balboa HPOZ?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Can you say something about the four different models of Balboa HPOZ?
The four models.
Of Balboa HPOZ.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Balboa.
Well, there were the two flat roof models, and then there was a model that had more of an A-frame with a front gable, and then sort of a flat roof front gable combination one that Linda showed a photograph of, where you had sort of the flat roof and then a center front gable. Do you mean from the interiors, or? Well, SurveyLA and all of the photographs that we showed were just from the public right-of-way. We don't go on to people's private property, but for the HPOZ tours, people were allowed to go into the home. So.
And each of the Balboa Highlands houses have an interior atrium. That's a sort of that indoor-outdoor sense, but it's shielded from the street, and so that's 400 square feet out of the 2,000 to 2,500 square feet of the house, and those were used for passive recreation or to put all kinds of plants in, but it was a way to bring the indoors out and still have that privacy from the street. That was very much an attribute of Eichler, that you go into your house and you pull away from society and it's happy and peaceful. So it was a very different style of housing that we actually see some of. Corbin Palms is actually the same kind of design. Palmer and Krisel, who did that, were very similar in that too, is the home as retreat, that you pull away from society when you come in.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Excuse me, I'd seen a prior presentation on the LA survey, and if I'm not mistaken, there's the ability to have social cultural history added to that. I believe even after the fact, either by owners or community people or whatever, or if you knew the information ahead of time and you downloaded it as part of your survey work. Do you have any sense of how much that's actually been incorporated, strictly other than a visual architectural look?
Yeah, our context statement is architecture, residential development, cultural development, commercial development, and under cultural, we're able to identify buildings that are important homes or sites in the cultural history of Los Angeles. In one of the latest survey groups, we were looking at an area around the Lockheed Martin aircraft plant in Burbank. Burbank's not in the city of Los Angeles, but a number of the people who worked there lived around there. And this was a very early area for LGBT bars. And so we were able to identify a number of some of the earliest sort of underground, but published in various sort of city guides, LGBT bars in the city of Los Angeles. And we used the cultural context to do that. And that's all in the preloaded context statement, which we use drop-down menus for in the FIGS program in the field.
Did you have any instances where owners of the communities, after you've done the survey, came forward that you were able to add to?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how many incidences, but people are always coming to us with lists of properties that are associated with important individuals in the city of Los Angeles. And one of the great things about the program is, the FIGS program, is we're able to add those in later. Once the reports have been published, it's harder to edit them, but it's growing, it's evolving. So.
But it is important as part of this that there is a mechanism to add, because we knew going in that a lot of the cultural and historic associations were not going to be known. And so everything is very clear in the survey that with the information we have, this is eligible or this isn't eligible. But the things can become, historic from more information. And what's been interesting to me, being on the survey review committee, is how some neighborhoods have a lot of information. There'll be, two historians that, meet for coffee and talk about the most, esoteric, historic information about their neighborhood. They'll have a lot, and then you'll have a whole neighborhood where there's really nobody that has either come forward or that is really paying that much attention to it. So it just really depends, and I think that's going to be one of the kind of the next steps after the survey is done, is to really kind of think through what neighborhoods do we need to be working in and how do we better find those resources so that we can tell the story of all Angelenos.
The survey takes a long time. One group of the survey will usually take about a year. And so over that time, we find out more and more about each area and add to it as we record.
Well, one of the stories that came out that I loved was a suburb, or a little suburb, that a lot of the original owners were still there. So as they were going out and taking the pictures, people started trickling out saying, "What's going on? My house is historic, really?" Well, the developer, and then one went in and got the original brochure that they still had. They bought the property, so it was, it was kind of this awakening that, I guess we have lived here a long time. I guess it has been 50 years. So of really getting that sense, and so those stories are there, and so that to me was just one of the great stories of people saying what's going on and coming out, and then being part of that conversation.
So one of you mentioned that one of the problems can be that people are putting up hedges, and you showed the hipster couple with their low water garden. Is landscape looked at all in the survey, or is it just in the physical form of the house?
It depends how we're identifying something. For garden apartments, for example, when the landscaping is intact, when there are mature sycamore trees, we note that in the evaluation. If we can't see the house because there's a hedge, that usually becomes what we call a QQQ, which is a more research needed aspect of it. But we do call out designed landscapes as well, independent of architecture. So there are a number of ways that we identify landscape depending on their context.
And the HPOZs, the preservation plans, do take into account landscaping. And what has been interesting is, LA is basically a desert, although we pretend that we have lush green lawns, which are appropriate. And so what we're doing now with some of the HPOZs, and we did this at we do an HPOZ workshop every year with the planning department, and we actually brought together 5 landscape architects to look at how do you use drought tolerant or low water plants but still retain that sense of a front yard. And there's about 4 different kinds of little plants that when you plant a bunch of them, they actually look like lawn. And so that's been we're trying to get the education out there, because people are getting in their water bill every month, to pull out your lawn. And so, how do you do that in a historic district and still sort of retain that sense of landscape?
Yeah, I heard all the propaganda for the garden of Los Angeles, and I remember being shocked the first time that I went to find out it was really a desert, and that if somebody wasn't watering it, there was nothing growing except a few oak trees or something.
We have a lot of oak trees. So.
Yes.
I think this is really interesting. Oh, sorry. This is really interesting information for studying historic urbanisms. I'm wondering, your GPS information and your database-driven information, would that be available to researchers at some point? And then I have a second question, and that is, I just read American Association of American Geographers report on demographic changes in LA, and it's now incredibly ethnic. I think it's 28% white, and then everything else. So I was wondering how that might affect the way that you do the survey and you work with communities.
I'll take the first part of that because it's the GIS question. The GIS data all belongs to the City of Los Angeles and is used in their planning department. So it's, for public access, it would be a question of what the City of Los Angeles is willing to share. The FIGS program has been developed with the City of Los Angeles and the Getty Foundation, and the Getty has used that program to create even more GIS-based programs, including the ARCHES program for ancient resources. I don't know what the plans are to make specific survey area data public, but within the community of consultants that are working on the project, we all talk about our GIS capabilities and share as we're doing the surveys to help each other and be better informed.
And I just want to add on that, part of the whole concept of GIS is that all the planning in Los Angeles is GIS, and the hope was not to have a planner come in, someone wants to pull a permit and then have to go somewhere else and look. So the whole idea was to to use the system that the planners use and not something else. And so I think that long term that's going to be very efficient, but we're still kind of, I think working through some of that. I did want to answer your question about reaching different ethnic groups, and that is something that in Los Angeles means you need to have more languages than just English. And SurveyLA did do an early brochure about kind of my SurveyLA that was, I believe, in Spanish, that they were doing outreach to. At the Conservancy 4 years ago, we actually hired a full-time staff person who was bilingual and Latina, and now we have she left, now we have a Latino, but to really work in these neighborhoods, because what we really saw is that the early suburbs from the teens and the 20s were 98% Latino neighborhoods, and how do we have the conversation about what is significant? And I have to say, it has been incredibly rewarding to have this person on our staff, because the information that we're finding out about what people care about in their neighborhood is phenomenal. And as an example, Pico Union, which is an HPOZ from the teens and 20s. It was a very wealthy white enclave that now is predominantly Central American immigrants. And when we did the survey, one of the things that was very important to them was the fact that it was a site of the sanctuary movement in the 80s from El Salvador. And so in 1920s, Lutheran Church, which still conducts services in Swedish on Christmas Eve, became the center of the sanctuary movement in Los Angeles. And so we included that church, not because it was from the 1920s and was this great piece of architecture, but because it was the center of the sanctuary movement. And that alone changed how people in the neighborhood perceived the brochure that we produced, the history, and there was a lot more interest in terms of, okay, tell me the story about where I live, and who was the wealthy person that the house has now been divided into 20 apartments. And so I think that, for us, at least at the Conservancy, we've seen a dramatic change in how we communicate, but it's about language. And so we really need to either, learn Spanish or Korean or tag along or whatever the different languages are, but we need to be doing a better job at having the choir sing in more languages.
Yep.
We have a rapid change of the climate, and the necessity to reduce traffic out of cars, and the preservation of neighborhoods of a city that is so extended in all these areas, in this valley and so on. What is the future of the preservation if we must change cities, in cities without so much traffic?
Want me to do that? Yes. It's a very important question, and one of the reasons why we're excited about SurveyLA is knowing where the historic resources are. So there's a lot of places where historic resources are not. And so as Los Angeles is, and that's a good thing. I mean, because we need to build somewhere. And we tend to view those as opportunity sites. And so, how do we begin to think about how we're going to do transit development? And obviously we need to increase our density. And so by knowing what's historic and what's not, we can go at a key intersection and say, okay, there are 2 historic buildings at 2 corners, but looky here, 2 of them do not have a historic building. Have at it. But these 2 we really care about. And so I think it changes the dynamic of decision making. to be able to say, here's what's historic and we're going to fight you to the death, and here is where you have some opportunities. But talking about the yes sometimes, I mean, I think part of this is very important. We've had a lot of conversation about post-war development on the commercial side, and one thing that we've been very grateful for is that post-war commercial development has huge amounts of surface parking. They didn't build parking structures immediately in the post-war period, so they just had a sea of parking. So we had the Century Plaza Hotel, where they're building 2 huge towers behind that, saving the hotel itself. We're looking at Capitol Records, which is going to have 2 of the highest buildings built in Los Angeles at 53 stories, which is preserving Capitol Records but building very high density behind it. And part of the concept there is that they're going to go higher in order to pull the building back from Capitol Records. So it gives Capitol Records, as one of our iconic buildings, more breathing space. And Capitol Records has a metro stop within a half a block of it. So this is an appropriate place for density to occur. So I think that preservation needs to be part of the conversation. I think we've often been excluded, partly because we didn't know what was historic, and we didn't sort of know all the guys that were doing transportation planning. But I think that that's really changing, and part of it in Los Angeles, where we are building, the metro rail to the ocean, and all this are going to be 113 metro rail stations open in the next 20 years. There's a lot of stuff happening, and we just need to make sure that preservation is one of the factors, while still supporting a much more green environment in terms of building density.
Yes, way in the back.
What you just spoke about, that geographic area, is that up by Ivor where the Aldo Nido is, or that general area, is that being preserved?
The Avenido?
Yeah, I believe it's Ivor, that general area.
Yes, that's
because
here.
You look right down, I believe, on the Capitol building, right up. But that's what you're talking about, that general area?
Yeah, and it's very controversial because all those people in the hills are going to see these tall towers. So it's an argument that LA is still very much having right now.
Anyone else? Yes, Carolyn.
How many people, Los Angeles is vast. How many people are working on the LA survey? I finished a survey recently of Long Island, and I did it for the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities, and it took me 10 years, and it was me and my car, and we got, meaning the Society, grants from the New York State Council of the Arts and so forth. And basically what I did was look for significant architecture and patterns of development. And actually, in listening to you speak about Los Angeles and seeing what you've put up, I see huge similarity to Long Island. Long Island was the middle of Long Island, a huge part of it was the second largest prairie in the United States. And up until the 1880s, tourists used to go out to New York and from New York and from all over the East Coast and elsewhere, even Europe, to look at the grasses. It was a very flat place, and there are entire neighborhoods all over the place. Some of them are ranch style. Some of them are colonial revival. Some of them are even Spanish sort of revival. There's a tremendous amount of eclecticism. I used to live in LA. When I started doing my survey work on Long Island, I thought, wait a minute, I'm back in LA again. I left LA because I didn't like the traffic. And I think there is more similarity than, I think that's interesting. But you live out there, so you probably haven't seen Long Island and driven around. And, but the ranch house was a national phenomenon. And Sunset Magazine in the 40s started promulgating the ranch house style, and the house magazines in New York picked up those ranch house styles. And on Long Island, because it was so close to all the epicenter of publishing was in New York, so I found numerous examples of show houses. And all through from the late 40s into the 50s, they were these kinds of ranch houses.
Well, that actually, Carolyn, that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation tonight, was because I don't think that we in the East are looking at these types of buildings the way they are in Los Angeles. And it's a challenge to us because we should be.
Well, We tried on Long Island.
I know,
but
I
it
know.
was
You
one
in your
person. So
survey.
my next, can you answer the question?
Yeah,
How
your
many
question about
people?
staff.
I mean,
Yeah.
I did it with a society, and I ended up basically in the end just putting a list together of 501 architects who I deemed to be important and who did modernism. So, but
Well,
I'm wondering, you're doing this hugely ambitious project.
It's very ambitious.
How many people?
How many people? There are a number of people in the Office of Historic Resources for the City of Los Angeles. They have one person who's reviewing all of our data as we submit it, but everybody in the office is involved in some way. They have a GIS staff of 3 people who we work with. From the consultant side, that is a little more complicated. It depends on the day. The reconnaissance process, where we drive every single street of a group, that involves 3 mid or senior architectural historians in a car together for the entire day. During an 8-hour day, well, it'd usually take us 3 8-hour days to do 10,000 parcels. Depending on the street layout, cul-de-sacs are harder because you drive every street twice. From there, the consultants go out with 1 architectural historian and 1 intern. And as a team with a tablet and a computer, you record the resources that have been identified. We try and keep it so that there's 1 pair for every group area. And a survey group can include usually 4 areas. So in that case, you have 8 people going out. Once we've collected all of this data, written all of our reports, it becomes, or the review committee gets involved. And the review committee is
5 people.
5 people. So, and there's usually 1 community area specialist who's brought on for that part of it. And then throughout the process, we have a number of historians and area specialists that we consult, researchers who are doing work specific to whatever area we're looking at.
And how many consulting firms are working on this?
It depends on the group. For the next phase, or the next group of surveys, which will include 2 areas of the San Fernando Valley, and then the Westlake area and the Echo Park area, there are 3 different consulting firms who are working on that, and an additional 1 or 2 historians who are specialists in the area. So I guess the short answer is at any
like
point,
a
usually
military
between,
campaign.
Yeah, it's
really
a lot of
well
coordinating.
organized, incredible.
Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the socioeconomic element of the preservation process, in the sense that, well, the people who have to view the towers being put up behind the Capitol Records building are quite wealthy, so they get to have their voices heard. And you mentioned that a lot of the communities that you're working with are ethnic communities, many of which are middle class or lower income communities. And what is being done in order to enable them to pursue preservation projects on a level that is consistent with the standards that you have explained to us today?
Sure, I think that's a great question, particularly about a city of Los Angeles. What we see is a lot of our HPOZs, almost half of the resources identified in our HPOZs are lower middle class and lower class. And so preservation is not an elitist activity. We certainly have some wealthy neighborhoods that have been designated, but we also have seen a lot in the, in kind of the other side. And one of the things we've really found is that not having a lot of money is actually good preservation. So they're not going to Home Depot and getting new windows, and they're often fixing them. And we've done outreach. We did it particularly in Pico Union. We worked with a local community development corporation to do training on how to fix wood windows and different things like that. But I think part of it's education, part of it is really outreach. One of our biggest advocacy issues right now, which we talked about earlier, was Wyvenwood, which is a garden apartment. It's about 98% Latino, lower middle class, rent control ordinance. And it is the big developer who's come from Miami, hired, you know, the top people in LA to come in and try and get their project. And then we've been working with the residents of Wyvenwood to try and articulate why it is important to save that. And I think that we've been able to do a good job in terms of when we first started working in Wyvenwood, it was all about we don't want to move. And so then as we began to work, it's like, well, what are the qualities here that you love? Well, as is typical in garden apartments, it has a huge amount of, you know, kind of open space. So we love the mall, we love the green space. Okay, well, let's talk about that in terms of historic preservation, because there are more laws that can actually help in terms of historic preservation than they can just for, I don't want to be kicked out of my home. And so we've really kind of, I think, built up a very kind of trusting relationship in terms of talking about that. But I think, you know, part of that's the language thing of how do you talk about these issues. Why do you care about where you live now, and what makes you value that? And then how do you go forward? And I will say that, you know, I think that, you know, from a preservation angle, we've very well explained it's the oldest, it's big, it's blah, 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 blah. But when you hear these tenants talk about this, your heart goes out. And I think that that's a very important part of the pitch for why preservation is important, is that this is where these people live. And I think that that can never be underestimated in the value of that.
Well, that, I think, is a really good message on which to end the evening. So thank you, Linda and Allison.